Hello everyone, today we talk about the Holy Roman Empire from the Ottonians to the Salians, more specifically from the imperial crowning of Otto I to the crowning of Conrad II of Franconia. And it's really an outlook, really. Schwerpunkt has now a kind of hefty playlist about the Ottonians, so if you want to have a bit more of context, look at that. We're not going to repeat it during the video. So it's really a short story, a perspective, right, from Otto I to Henry II, actually, for what concerns the Ottonians and the rise of the Salians, and more specifically this continuity in the discontinuity, right? The idea that the Holy Roman Empire, albeit being established and having, by now, it wasn't even called like that. We made recently a video about from the Imperium Francorum to the Imperium Romanum Christianum, right? So this the concept that lays at the base of the Renovatio Imperii, that the Ottonians were the greater boosters of, in especially from an ideological point of view. The Ottonians are overlooked, especially in their cultural legacy, right, in what they were able to build. In terms of a legitimistic imperial authority in the West, the Carolingian Empire, as you know, had survived in this legacy of the Frankish Empire that substantially it's the same, right? I'm not a great fan of the idea that the Holy Roman Empire was founded in 962 with Otto I. It's really the continuity of an idea of empire that is actually much more universal and a-dynastic, a-ethnic in many ways, and that was exactly the dream that the dynasts here were pursuing, right? We'll see it exemplarily well with Otto III, that basically began to rule from Rome, not even kind of caring about Germany so much. And yet we have to observe in all this systemic instability, because the same Ottonian rule was far from being actually territorialized one, a stable one, and it fundamentally crumbled at some point. This chaining, for example, of Germany to Italy, all the various institutional ether for the imperial crowning that passed through them, it's something that was fully established now, right? Both for what concerns the Germanic elective the dynamic, and also the unavoidable papal crowning that needed in turn, however, the securing of the Italic kingdom first. Even in here, there are certain kind of shades that we should better stress. I mean, how for example, the papal patrimony was not considered technically as part of the Kingdom of Italy, right? The emperors naturally in their secular rule considered and had all the reasons to think that Rome was within the Italic kingdom specifically, and therefore also belonged to it as a earthly domain. But from a papal point of view, this had a much greater transcendental dimension that exactly in these years, the ones of Otto III and of Gerbert of Aurillac, aka Pope's Buster II, were enhanced and fully developed in by a certain degree, at least. That obviously this already existed since the Donatio Constantini, if not before. But what happened in this place and within and under the Ottonian government was to eventually inspire, paradoxically, even the same Gregorian reform, right? And the detachment of the papal policy from the imperial one, and this idea of purification of the church that had been started, ironically, by the same emperors, by the same Ottonians specifically, right? So this is an extremely important time that we have addressed in this terms of, in fact, also in the previous videos, that must be understood also in under the light of international policy. What were the Ottonians doing this time? Where they ruled? What kind of control they had? What goals overall in Europe and the Mediterranean they were trying to achieve, right? And we start from 962 with the securing of the Italic and especially the imperial crown by Otto I, right? And the key here is understanding the importance of the Italic kingdom as such, right, in its political, institutional, and strategic dimension for the German emperors. For the simple reason that the Ottonian power, as we've seen also in the other videos, had pretty marked limits, right? The Ottonians had risen fundamentally just as an obscure family, right? They didn't have any illustrious ancestor except for Widukind, right? So this is it was in a way the Saxon identity was strong at the time, and especially also the Saxon historiographers were very proud in this sense, in an ethnical and an anti-universal ideal that instead the dynasts were trying to push themselves. Think about the the biographer Widukind, that didn't like at all the idea that this was a Christian Roman Empire. He said, it was the Saxons, it was the Germans who conquered this, right? But the picture was completely different, and for any empire here that wanted to extend its control over wide areas, we're talking about 10th century Europe. I mean, there are not central bodies of government. This is basically a huge floating, let's say, a rule that floats over a huge clienteling system that is constantly unstable, right? The Ottonians control effectively only the two important, though, regions of Germany that are Saxony and then Franconia, right? Franconia, as we'll see, with the same Salians, eventually will rise to the next ruling area of Germany, as this this continuity with the Frankish grandeur of the empire, of the most westernized areas of Germany. While Saxony was the iron fist, right? The military element in this region that, as the Carolingians managed to subdue, but in which the Vassalic beneficiary system was still relatively underdeveloped, and this favored, in part, the permanence of a more military character, right? But from the other, also the difficulty to levy more troops, right? And that's why the Ottonians were concerned in levying, let's say, a bit of troops from many places, so to put together, especially, however, in this were as always crucial, the ecclesiastical contingents, a decent army that could go subdue certain areas, and especially the Mediterranean was naturally much wealthier, more populated, more advanced, civilly speaking, than Germany, and where the same Ottonians wanted to shift their center of power. Just remember, this is the leitmotif of all the Holy Roman Emperors, right? And especially in this phase from the Ottonians to the Hohenstaufen, right, in the mid-13th century, this was the idea. As we were saying before, the capital of the empire had to be physically Rome, right? With the Hohenstaufen, also Sicily if it was possible, but Rome was preferential, because what does a Roman emperor do? It rules from Rome, right? And this naturally meant also to control the papacy, and therefore reuniting this enormous power of the earthly and spiritual power altogether. And also the Mediterranean naturally was associated strategically with the possibility of conquering Constantinople and to reunite East and West fundamentally, in their view, and to recreate an ecumenic empire, right? The ones who got the closest to achieve this were objectively the Hohenstaufen in the second half of the 12th century. The thing failed, but it was objectively the right path to do. Nationalistic historiography wanted to stress the fact that these German emperors were kind of running after the chimeras, right? And they should have not gone in the Mediterranean, should have not mingled with also people that didn't care about Germany, etc. But this is, an idea that, historically speaking, doesn't make any sense whatsoever, because, of course, that was the most intelligent and by far the most advantageous and effective thing to do, right? And the Ottonians themselves went, after all, pretty close, as Otto III ruled from Rome itself, but as we will see, in fact, there were major problems in achieving this. But what did Germany offer? As such, it was a land that was basically impossible to centralize. In many ways, was still very, backwards. It was fiercely still tied to this ideal of political autonomy / freedom, at least of the oligarchies of the local duchies that still considered themselves fundamentally as peoples on their own, right? It was not even properly a German identity. There was this Eastern Frankish kingdom. It was rising, and this idea of the Teutonic people that more or less was, the one comprehended between the borders of the Rhine and the Elbe rivers at this point, because from the other side, also as we know, before the so-called the eastward expansion, let's say Germany ended on the Elbe, the rest was populated by the Slavs eastwards, that had also necessarily to be integrated in the system, like it happened with Bohemia as a duchy that also became a major political and institutional player of the empire. And the policy pursued in this sense, it was the most effective one, because you couldn't centralize in this situation. There were simply not enough resources. You should have gone at war with all these various German duchies and terribly warlike communities that would have bled white. The meager private assets, even of powers of to be reckoned with, like Saxony and Franconia combined. And the best way was essentially to float and to extend horizontally, right? Superficially, we could say, the nominal rule of the empire, and essentially to draw enough from all these various lands in order also to back local, certain local policies, right? There were, and especially the ones of the church. Like the church was here we can't talk just about the Roman Church, because as the local churches were, quite proud of their autonomy, Rome was yet to develop the monarchical idea of the church and so on. But essentially, the ecclesiastical lordships were generally supportive of the the public institutions, because they were the ones who had more to benefit from it. They were regularly these authorities recognized their privileges of immunity. They made justice, like they had an authority. They fought with a sword, right, to defend their territories from the private expansionism of the various secular lords. So this is, in a nutshell, the history of imperial policy in Germany, in Italy, especially in the Ottonian times, but even famously also in France and in England. They definitely owe a lot to the ecclesiastical support for the development of monarchies at this time, where especially in France, not so that there was no teleological connection with their future development in this regard, and the situation was very, very complicated. So, considering in all of this the constant enmities, even in the northern and the eastern frontier, with the Danish, with the Slavs, right? But the goal was Italy, throughout all the Middle Ages, overwhelmingly rich as much as overwhelmingly fragmented from a political point of view. So what's the best option ever? Why did everybody wanted to seize the peninsula? Well, it's self-evident. And it did make a huge lot of sense, without mentioning the fact that controlling Rome by itself was effectively for the whole Christianity, right? At this time, the schism between Rome and Constantinople had not happened yet. So Rome was technically, even if Constantinople still kind of said that they were equals to Rome, but Rome was officially recognized as detaining the primacy of honor, right, of all the Christian churches, and its spiritual and moral prestige was enormous, right? Rome was not at the head of the ecclesiastical hierarchy yet. That the thing was forming. It was already a very imposing ecclesiastical center over the others. Especially, it had this far-ranging connections with all Western churches, but the Eastern alike. Actually, the popes were playing exactly in this sense. I mean, to be recognized even as a kind of a moral, spiritual arbiter over the two empires. Right, the papal policy in general throughout all the medieval times has been of a radical intellectual superiority over, like, these people controlled from a signory was actually, from a political military point of view, wasn't a big deal. They managed to control Europe, right, with a moral tool, and with also this extreme ability in exploiting exactly the differences, the attritions that existed between the various churches, but also with the secular authorities. But this is really another chapter that yet begins to develop consistently also in these times, right? But there was also the other major problem in this regard. The Byzantine Empire, right? So those guys were effectively the from a juridical institutional point of view, the Romans. Point. End of the discussion. Here it's not a matter of personal opinion. The concept here was that in terms of Roman law proper, only another emperor could recognize another imperial authority, right? The Westerners actually were playing more subtly, and in my opinion, in a way that I massively reevaluated over time, but that evidently up to this point lacked, and the Ottonians, once again, were very important to develop this instead, this intellectual means, right? The main thing had been since the Carolingian times, we are the emperors simply because we effectively rule Europe. Right, this is not a matter of asking or saying, well, what's the legalistic distinction of the thing. We rule sword in hand, an empire that from Roman times no one ever has ever seen here. And we are Christians. God wanted this, and we have even been confirmed by the papal authority. So even if this was something completely unedited, right? It was definitely very ambiguous and criticizable. The same relation between the Franks in Rome weren't clear, right? As they weren't the ones between Rome and Constantinople, telling the truth. Because here, once again, the papacy was playing in such a subtle, in crazily intelligent way that they were basically exploiting every single weakness of these contendants to build their own legitimacy and authority over them, right? But the point was that as long as there was a Roman Empire, right, out there, and this didn't recognize the Germanic one, there was always a great problem, because it was mainly a dynastic one. It was not even one of legitimacy, because who was in Europe really challenging the imperial authority? After all, the idea of this sovereign public authority representing universal power in Europe had not disappeared even after the fall of the Carolingian Empire, right? The Ottonians didn't really reinvent the empire. That's why I don't like the idea that here something like the Holy Roman Empire was founded. Aside from the fact that at the time it wouldn't be called like that in 300 years, but the point is that the continuity of the Imperium, right, was self-evident. They didn't even need to re-elaborate it. We are the ones who are in fact obsessed with the formalization, with categories. But for these people, the empire, since antiquity, like even the same Germans at the outskirts of the Roman Empire, believed that there was an empire, that there was a spiritual, religious symbol of universal rule that fell from the skies, from the heavens, and that conferred the authority to rule to the vanquisher. Right? This was the universal moral ideology, basically, as far as I know, of all the peoples in the world. Right at the time, there wasn't any other aim but managing to extend your power to all over the globe. Right? And the other interesting thing in this regard is that the same Western Europeans had never fallen out of, they had never abandoned the awareness that that if maybe they weren't in a Roman Empire proper anymore before Charlemagne, there was a Roman Empire out there, and they were somewhat part of it. Like, look at what the Merovingians built their power like, what the Visigoths built their power like. Even in Anglo-Saxon England, at this time you find terms like, not even like imperator, but as basileus. That is the Greek for emperor in their monarchic, diplomas, right? That's a deep awareness of the Romanity of imperial power, and all of these Romano-Germanic kingdoms indeed realized that it was a next step out there, that eventually the ethnic power had basically taken over, right? Anglo-Saxon England, after all, still, these were elitisms that just the monarchic chancery invented to you can find them even in the kingdom of the Asturias, right? What kind of emperors were they after all? But that's the point that we often don't get fully, is that an emperor is he who rules with a God-given right in this regard. And this was always of natural Roman inspiration, not just because the official language of the polities was Latin, but because everybody knew that there was a Roman Empire there. And this sense had not disappeared since ancient times. We are the ones who have, emotionally decided that in 476 the Roman Empire in the end stopped to exist, right? That there was, there was not a Roman dimension, a universalistic ecumenic rule anymore, right? The thing was still there. Nobody ever tried or thought to deny it, also because it was a potential source of power, right? And that's what the Ottonians now were looking for. And for many reasons that in this sense are, of course, ideological in part, they were a challenge to the same Byzantine Empire, began now to expand, also with reasonable strategical goal, in southern Italy, that was held by the Byzantines. So definitely relations had not been friendly, as you know. In the same Charlemagne had fought against the Byzantines. Heraclius Byzantine held territories. His son had even died in the lagoons in the swamps out of Venice during the siege of those territories. But the point is, Italy was this kind of broader frontier area, right? The Longobard kingdom as such had this articulated dimension. The Franks basically incorporated the Longobard kingdom, and they recognized a parallel legitimacy as the Frankish one. This is very important historically. The Franks didn't do it with any other people. And the reason was that, aside from the fact that the Franks estimated the Longobards a freaking lot, they also inherited a kingdom that at its conquest was brutally more civilly advanced than the Franks had ever seen. Like, the Longobards were literate. They had developed a very efficient juridical system. They ruled from the cities. They had skilled personnel. The Franks basically were ignorant like goats. Like, literally, they had no idea what the concept of public authority even meant. They knew how to do one thing only. They knew how to do better than everybody. That was war, and that's how they built an empire. But more enlightened minds like Charlemagne and Louis the Pious, that also had the luck to had all their brothers dead, right, well, before coming to rule, at least up to from a certain point onwards, and tried to centralize in this sense, were legitimately concerned about creating a more persistent structure in this regard. They failed, right? They failed. There was no way to centralize places like Francia, right? These were areas that were so deeply imbued with an exclusively privatistic view of politics that they couldn't conceive a sovereign authority, aside from a strictly military point of view. Right, and the only ones who actually developed in this regard was the church, right? The church, the monasteries, this broader net, this connective tissue of post-Carolingian Europe lived on. That's where also the the reform of the Carolingian clergy and the script, and this cultural renewal remained. Actually, that's one of the main accomplishments of the Carolingians, after all. That would be very important also in Ottonian times, because the Ottonians were extremely they made extreme use of these monastic centers, especially to boost their true intellectual, historical, philological research, the legitimacy of the imperial foundations of the same empire. But as we were saying, Italy was, it was the central and northern part. Actually, the most unitary part was the north. Like the Po Valley had been the heartland of the Lombard Empire. Then it was Lombard Kingdom, excuse me, and then there was Tuscany and Liguria, this broader Tyrrhenic area. There also was Lombard, and there were other Lombard territories that were across, technically, the former Byzantine corridor between Rome and Ravenna, that the Longobards had incorporated short before the Carolingians conquered the kingdom. And then there were these other two duchies, in fact, in the south. Let's say one was Spoleto, was in the center of Italy, kind of a mountainous area where very independent-minded. They created a lot of problems. There were even emperors, right? Dukes of Spoleto actually crowned by the Pope as Roman emperors at that point. And then this large Duchy of Benevent, right? And the Duchy of Benevent was a very interesting power, because basically it was in between the Frankish-dominated area, right? You know that in Carolingian times there was a Carolingian kingdom of Italy. It was also the most, if not the most effective necessarily, but the most unitary, like the one that had, in fact, thanks to the Longobard legacy, a greater deal of institutional and administrative unity, and that technically had to comprehend the Duchy of Benevent. But the Duchy of Benevent was behind the Papal territories, bordered the Byzantine area, and also was located into the along the Apennines in this very difficult heartland to reach. Right, the Carolingians campaigned there more than once, but they basically never managed to subdue these territories. That also had a pretty strange history on their own. We made a video on the Langobardi. I'm meaner to explain a little bit. They split at a certain point. There was Salerno from one side, Benevent from the other. But the point is that they also kind of exploited the southern Longobards exploited this frontier position to wink either at the Carolingians in northern Italy or at the Byzantines in southern Italy. And this was very clever, because they also enhanced their power. They passed from dukes to princes, also because they felt that they were somewhat the last Longobards, right? Because effectively, also many Longobards of the north had fled into these territories when the Carolingians took over. There was a great, after all, there was a great connection, even culturally speaking. Think about Paul the Deacon that had taken refuge in Benevent, but also, frequented the Carolingian court. And these were territories that were always on the frontier. Either you were, from a Germanic perspective, from a Byzantine perspective, it was definitely not easy to campaign in this territory. There are certain areas in southern Europe that are just plain nightmare, right? Like campaigning in Spain or in Italy or in the Balkans is a total nightmare. And the point is, you could never fully subdue these territories. But the Ottonians at this point, when they had secured somewhat control, at least this, Saxony, Franconia, other areas of Germany loosely, and of Italy, they tried to annex this Byzantine territories in southern Italy. That was also an area that was consistently urbanized and very well served by maritime naval infrastructures, right? That was at the center of the Mediterranean, and seizing these lands had an enormous significance in general, and they were contended to Rome. So even to Constantinople, and even to seize these territories from the Byzantines equated to say, we are the guys who, in this spiritual religious view of the empire, we are the ones who God chose to rule in this land. This was an enormous deal. And naturally there were many other contrasts in this regard, because now East and West had substantially separated. The the Germanic Empire, indeed the Byzantine Empire were also culturally speaking very, very apart, right? They did share this common values in part, but they came from very different backgrounds, so there wasn't also much of a mutual appreciation. But especially the Byzantines were aware from their point of view that recognizing even once imperial legitimacy to the West, right, didn't a Roman legitimacy especially was a display of weakness. Actually, the Byzantines back in the day of Charlemagne had recognized the title of Imperator, right, but not specifying Imperator Romanorum, right? They prefer to say, okay, you rule, we recognize, we acknowledge that objectively, yeah, you have an empire that stretches from Spain to Poland, from Bretagne to Rome, but you're not Romans, right? And this was the toughest thing, like it was, and that's why also in Western Europe in general, there was this sense is that, of course, the Byzantines were the Greeks, right? So they called them that to trigger them, and that they were, even if they were Romans, it was nothing really, to be proud of, right? If you read Liutprand of Cremona, that was essentially an Italian, but he felt he was a Longobard, and that he belonged to this stock of Germanic peoples that had actually come to rule in the former Roman territories, and that had seized them with arms, and that God had granted to the right to rule. So there was even this underlying ethnic tension between these Germanic peoples that ideally had taken over, right, the Roman world, and the Roman Empire that had shrunk. And there were extremely bitter skirmishes between the two, right? Because they both had their reasons after all. And as we have seen, their imperial concepts also revolved on, if you want, on different shades of what the legitimacy had to be in the first place. But it's obvious that most of the times the only way to assert which was the ultimate goal was by decided with arms, right? So this Ottonian expeditions in southern Italy actually failed, right? It was a very, even in here, it was definitely strategically worth to do it, but it went badly, right? There are certain turns that history could have taken hadn't the Ottonians failed in these expeditions, if it had not been defeated at Cotrone, for example, by the Saracens that were from Sicily, were also expanding towards the Italian, in the Italian peninsula, also exploiting the local weaknesses, sometimes even called as mercenaries, a bit like will happen with the Normans in the same exact areas 1 century afterwards. So the Ottonians recognized that the best way to deal with the Byzantines after the failure was to acquire a diplomatic recognition of the new authority of the Western empires, at least as they conceived it, from the side of the same Byzantines, right? And especially Otto I wanted to sanction this recognition by establishing matrimonial ties, right? In order to obtain what with arms had not been possible to achieve. So there were actually many and difficult diplomatic missions that finally granted the Ottonians the achievement to one of his objectives. In fact, the Byzantine Emperor John Semicius, politically weak, also because he had risen to the throne after the assassination of his predecessor, ceded to Otto's pressures by recognizing de facto his rank and even agreeing to the marriage between his nephew Teofano, right, and Otto I's son, that was also named Otto. So this marriage had very important consequences, especially from a cultural point of view, because from the southern borders of the empire and up to the heart of the Saxon Empire, arrived this gust of Byzantine wind, right? That was not made just on customs modeled on the ones of Constantinople, but also actual people, skilled personnel, men of letters. The same Theophano was very proud of her role. She brought all this even classical knowledge that I think the Byzantines had preserved. The Ottonians weren't definitely great men of letters. At least Otto I especially was extremely ignorant, but he was a great commander, as always. That's what rulers had to be at the time. But this event provided the Ottonians with this cultural baggage that would have been very important to develop further, especially from an intellectual point of view. The construction of their ideological legitimacy as emperors, right? Because the same marriage had substantially seen the recognitions as peers from the side of Constantinople. This Byzantine cultural legacy would have especially given its fruits around the year 1000 with Otto III, right, the son of Otto II and Theophano. But let's go, step by step now. So Otto I, naturally, even through the marriage of his son with the Byzantine princess, hadn't abandoned the idea to acquire southern Italy territorially in a way or another, right? So, but this idea soon proved to be unrealistic, especially because the institutional legitimacy that the marriage embodied was also not founded on pretty sound basis, right? In fact, Theophano was a sort of second-rank princess, right? She was not actually the daughter, but even just the nephew of an emperor, and even more of an usurper, right? So, and in fact, after the death of his father in 973, Otto II had to verify that from the Byzantine side there was actually no intention to enact the established decisions, right? When in 976 John Zimisces died, as we've seen also in our Byzantine history playlist, recently rose to the throne the dethroned Macedonian dynasty that had actually always remained with Nicephorus II, with John Zimisces. These are ruled, even leaving the successors of the Macedonian emperors to on the throne, right? And with Basil II, right, that would have brought also Byzantine Empire to this new splendor. That the Byzantines renegated, like they actually denied the predecessors' choices, right? They didn't recognize anymore the imperial character of the Germanic Empire. Without mentioning, as we also hinted at before, that Otto II had to deal with the threat of the Saracens in southern Italy, right? He launched this expedition 982, and in Calabria his troops were annihilated by the Saracens. Like some of the major, the highest nobility of the Eastern Frankish kingdom was slain on the battlefield, including bishops. It was one of the greatest disasters of the German Empire, and Otto died also one year later suddenly. So this threw basically in a relatively in 10 years the Holy Roman Empire into a deep situation of crisis, right, of great danger, even for the same Ottonian dynasty, because now Otto's the second son, Otto III, was still a child, right, and the great of the empire, the princes of Germany and of Italy, now tried to reacquire their own space, like those various royal titles that had remained vacant, or simply re-expanding their power. And as we were saying before, there were no central institutions, right? So this was a huge problem because everything was based on sheer military power. If your allegiances switched from the rebel side, from the autonomous side, the empire was crumbling, right? Because there was actually nothing to sustain it anymore. And this was a great testing ground of especially these important women in the scene. The mother and the grandmother of Otto III, Theophanu, and Adelaide of Italy, that managed to grant to Otto III the succession to the paternal titles, right, that he could assume starting from 996, once that he had turned 16. And this naturally was an extremely troubled situation anyway, and Otto III had a very, very peculiar character in education and background, right? He had been bred in the myth of the empire, right? He had German and Greek blood, so he was substantially, he thought to reunite in his own persona the two empires, ideally, and throughout his life he tried to transform in reality this model of royalty that had been elaborated at the time by the intellectuals at his court, such as Gerbert of Aurillac, that we mentioned before, that had been his mentor, his preceptor, and that Otto had elected as Pope in 999. The figure of Gerbert of Aurillac is a radical importance in the history of Western civilization. He was basically the greatest papal figure to inspire the same Gregorian reform. He developed this first conscience of autonomy and universal power of the Church of Rome, even over the emperor. And he was a man of huge learning. At that time, he came from Auvergne in southern France. He was schooled in Spain, also a very close contact with Islamic culture. Therefore, he was educated in some of the most complete and advanced way possible at the time. He knew about everything, right? It was also Black Legend over him that was developed afterwards. But I mean, his huge knowledge in astronomy, in mathematics, even in music. I mean, he had really a complete education for those time standards, and he came in this regard from a much more universalistic background, even culturally speaking, that we can assume, right? He was essentially he was a Visigoth, let's be honest, because the spirit, like in southern France, even after the Merovingian conquest, was still very, very close to Spain, right? This idea that this broader areas of southwestern France had belonged once to the Visigoths, that had maintained their kind of influence. If you visit southern France, you can still breathe that air, right? This sense of the proximity of the Mediterranean, of Spain, and this cultural waves that were emanating from the Umayyad Caliphate, from this great center of learning, some of the most important schools of the area, including the one of Toledo, that would remain from when it passed from the Muslims to the Christians, still this most important translating school that produced from which all the treasures, the intellectual treasures of the East arrived in Europe. So he studied in Spain. He entered in contact with the Arab culture. Then he went to teach the young Holy Roman Emperor, and under the influence of a Greek mother, and then in an Italian context. I mean, think about how many influences at a time, right? And all at the highest levels of the ecclesiastical and political hierarchies, as you realize here. And he assumed as Pope the name of Sylvester II. that is not anecdotal, because he recalled with such an evident symbology Sylvester I, that according to the Donatio Constantini, so this fake document was composed around the mid-8th century, during the 4th century, in fact in Constantinian times, had given the Church of Rome to, had seen the imperial donation to the Church of Rome of all the western territories of the empire. So this was the foundation, that the ideological foundation of the same aspirations of the papal control over wide areas of Western Europe that the popes had actually requested to the Carolingians ever since they basically invaded Italy and crushed the Lombard kingdom. The popes asked Charlemagne to come to rule basically the whole peninsula up to the north, the half of the north. There was this idea that the papacy had to extend overwhelmingly without any boundary and any resistance over the whole Christianity, even from an actually earthly point of view. This was an enormous deal, right? And we will have to talk more in detail about this specifically. And this all had a parallel influence, as we were saying at the beginning of the video, on the development of a deeper consciousness of the Church of Rome as the center of Christianity, even in terms of the actual ecclesiastical hierarchies, because it was practically already like that, but there were other centers that were challenging, even within the same Italy. Think about the Ravenna, right, where there was usually often an anti-Roman, anti-papal appointee. But the picture naturally was intertwined also with with Otto I ideals, right? And however, the political project of Otto I was very different from the one of his nephew and of Sylvester II, right? From an ideological point of view. In other terms, Otto III didn't practically care about the relations with the greats of the empire, right? He believed that his own authority and sovereignty were granted by the sacrality of his title. His grandfather had conquered an empire, like fighting with the Hungars, with the Italians, with the other Germans, expanding this control over a wide area, right? These were people who spent a lifetime on horseback fighting, and that's it. Otto III was, if you want, cerebral figure, right? A tormented one, was grown old in one of the most difficult times for the same empire, with a very difficult situation, also with different cultural models compared to the ones of his subjects, right? He, for example, didn't care about those who held the concrete powers on the territory, both in Germany and in Italy. So his view was rather based on the revival of the empire, the Renovatio Imperii, that was loaded with symbolic and sacral elements, right? And that were mismatching with the political reality of the empire, right? This clashed with a reality characterized by strong and violent local powers, right? And that's what effectively brought to the same overthrowing from Rome, right? There is this idea that Otto loved Rome. He considered himself not a Roman, but the emperor of the Romans. It was in the Holy Roman Empire, that the city of Rome and the Roman people, the Roman aristocracy, read better, had a huge importance, because without their acclamation, the emperor's the election was invalid. So the city at this time was still very, very, very powerful. The oligarchies were quite dynamic, aggressive, violent, and the local aristocracy didn't like at all to be ruled now by this figure that had also lacked the support in the rest of Italy, even in Germany. And these movements, that naturally were all intertwined across the Alps, brought to his expulsion from the same city. And in fact, he had to take refuge, shelter in a monastery outside Rome, where in 1001, when he was still very young, he died without leaving heirs, right? And this was even worse for the empire, because now there was a new struggle for the succession and for the redefinition of the imperial role and powers. So imagine in this picture that there is nothing stable, there is nothing still formalized, right? The Ottonians have actually managed to leave an important mark in this system, but the future could have, really overthrown all of this situation and seen of a more in controlled, institutional development. After all, as we will see in the 11th century, both Germany and Italy Germany remained an elective monarchy. Italy basically started, going on its own, even from Germany. So it was the beginning of this moment of detachment, even the rise of the cities, this local powers. And in this picture, the Ottonian dynasty had not extinguished. Like, there was still the Bavarian branch. Very important territorial power in southeastern Germany, right? They descended from Henry the Fowler, so the common ancestor to the Ottonian, let's say the Saxon line. And they had been a parallel power that actually is quite overlooked, also because their deeds have been overshadowed by Ottonian propaganda and historiography that were quite intense at the time. The Bavarian power was, for example, the one who took the brunt of the Magyar onslaught, and that also managed gradually to crush and to wear out the Hungarian power capabilities, so that when actually the greatest defeat was actually at the hands of the same Henry the Fowler at Riade. But for example, the celebrated battle of the Lechfeld by Otto I on the Hungars was definitely very, very important, but it came in a time in which the Magyar power had already faded because of this constant frontier warfare going on in southeastern Germany between them, in fact, and the Ottonian branch of Bavaria, that scored also important military successes that, however, historiography has not, sung in the same way of the Ottonian, of the Saxon branch, so that we even know, unfortunately, less. But in general, this the Bavarian branch had, let's call them better, they were the Ludolfings, as they were called, had represented a political alternative to the House of Saxony. They had competed against him. In fact, the same Henry II that rose at the King of Germany had supported the same overthrow of his nephew, right, the same Otto III. So they were a very influential family that managed to hold the power across Germany and Italy for 2 decades, right? Because albeit the contrasts that naturally ensued after the death of Otto III, Henry II was elected as King of Germany. He reigned from 1002 and 1024. He, as we've seen, he was Duke of Bavaria, essentially, and he was one of the great of the kingdoms, and could boast this relatively close relation with the House of Saxony. So there were elements of continuity, but also this alternative standpoint, right, that they began, in fact, to prove also in foreign policy, right, because Henry II renounced definitely to the Roman imperial dream of Otto III. He didn't care about the great Mediterranean adventure. At least he saw that he probably cared about it, but so that had been, there were much greater problems at this point. And in fact, he tried rather to reinforce his own authority towards the local powers that had consolidated within the boundaries of the empire, right, than searching for external adventures. For example, in Italy, he defeated the Marquis of Ivrea, Arduin, right, and this important following of lords that had elected him as king of Italy. This was very important because the Italic kingdom had its feudality, right, on its own, and this had participated in the previous centuries in this very harsh struggles in order to be elected as emperors, as we have seen before. There also was various the Marquises of Verona, for example, the Dukes of Spoleto. Then there had been also some provincial interventions, but in the following centuries, the rural aristocracy in Italy would be fundamentally absorbed within the cities and began to essentially expand from there, while the rest of the rural lineages would be gradually ousted, right, from the communal policy. But this time was still an Italic feudal consciousness that saw the possibility of electing an Italic king that could become also emperor. And in fact, the struggle against Arduin was intense, also because when he was defeated, also he rose multiple times. But the point is that even when these powers managed to descend in the Po Valley to defeat that there were always other lords that rose, right? That these enemies were never completely wiped out. There were agreements just to keep everything in this extremely precarious balance, and these powers, as the Ottonians actually had never managed to control. Hell, they didn't even control Germany as such, right? Just parts of it, right? And you can imagine in Italy the problem was even greater because the Ottonians had even renounced to wipe out these feudatories, but rather to ensure their control over the cities proper, and therefore granting this comital dignity to the local bishops that ruled from the cities, right? That in fact, that there is this struggle that took even an a sort of taste of ecclesiastical policy, because stereotypically, albeit not always overlappingly, there was a kind of pro-Italic secular nobility against a pro-Germanic ecclesiastical elite, right? And that in kind of countryside versus city, right? This was the general idea. Naturally, the thing was much more complicated, but this mess was never fully solved, right? And with Henry II, there is the gradual detachment of the empire from Italy, because even though the Salians tried to reestablish their control over the peninsula, they never reached the degree of control that Otto I had achieved, and it would take the Hohenstaufen in the second half of the 12th century to effectively try to restore it to the same levels, at least as a proper territorial domination. The idea is, however, that the same Henry II didn't manage to maintain the royal and imperial crown in the hands of his family, right? Simply because he died in 1024 without sons, right? So, as his successor was elected Conrad II, ruling between 1024 and 1039. He was the Duke of Franconia, right? So this chunk of Western Germany that had already partaken the Ottonian the Ottonian side back in the day, and had been, it was also one of the most economically and infrastructurally developed areas of Germany. Well served, connected by the rivers, fertile, colonized since Merovingian times by the Franks, and that, in fact, so this presence of the imperial dynasty for a consistently long time the Salians, right? The Salians, this lineage of far Frankish origins, actually, differently from the Ottonians that were, yeah, I mean, there was this obscure Carolingian count that we know basically nothing about, that had settled in Saxony. That's where the Ottonians had descended from, but we know nothing about him whatsoever. The Salians were a bit more prestigious, at least in their origins, and they managed to maintain the imperial crown for 4 generations up to 1125, and in spite of all the great contrasts with local powers, right? Conrad II intervened also since this time, in fact, in the bitter conflicts that were taking apart Milan. Think about later on the struggle for investors, like the conflict with the Papacy, this most dramatic moment in the contraposition of Henry IV and Pope Gregory VII. So that's another world, that's another story, but still it's important to remember here that this, especially the connection between the Eastern Frankish and the Italic kingdom in this regard, as a sort of gradual axis that consolidated as essentially for an political and institutional reason, right? And the idea that the empire and the papacy, even at the peak of their contrast, never disconfessed each other, right? They could disconfess the single personas, the single characters that covered the title, but never the idea that the empire had to be eliminated, or the papacy to be eliminated. That would have been completely, not even lunacy, was completely absolutely inconceivable in the mindset of the time. But also it was a way actually to back each other. I mean, the idea is that even if these two universal powers claimed superiority over one another, still the one recognizing the other was a very important way of essentially being institutionally legitimized in a time where there was basically no other authority out there, right? And even in the whole struggle for investors, the same, for example, gluing factor represented by the anti-Byzantine policy in some ways, especially from the German side, but the papacy sometimes used it as well. I think it's a bit more complicated, but I mean, it was a way of holding this empire in the West that had otherwise no other much official let's say fundament, and these two powers lived on, right? The papacy is still today the Holy Roman Empire up to the 19th century, in spite of all the massive changes, as you understand. But in the following centuries, and this is important, at the time, these powers increased enormously their authority, and even came very, very close to reach an actual dominion over all over Europe in terms, of course, in different ways. But I mean, in the second half of the 12th century, the Hohenstaufen went very, very close to reunite West and East, right, to rule both on Europe and the Mediterranean. The papacy in the beginning of the 13th century was at the apex of basically all Europe was its vassal name. So there is this is a very important hub of Western history that where everything began, sometimes even as an idea, right? That's why we stressed before so much the importance of Gerbert of Aurillac, right? In a situation where it was basically a far west. I mean, we've seen it with this German and Italian princes that would have taken over, right? Of course, trying to weaponize those same institutions and strengthening and backing them in their own perspective, but generally speaking, in a let's say, in a frame that, yeah, after all, was still boosting this system. I mean, the idea that the empire and the papacy were an irrenounceable authority after all, and that there had been a sort of guarantee of order and of stability that this empire, that this universal powers could provide, both, you know, secularly and spiritually. So, ecclesiastically. So aside from this, that there would be so much to say, because now all the things that come in my mind temporarily, but it's there is really a lot to cover on these topics, and we will do it on another occasion, but we will see it another time. So for now, I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it, otherwise leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming contents. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.